Center for the New South. Please welcome our speakers. Zakaria Abu Dahab, professor at the University Mohammed V in Rabat. Reda Yamouri, senior fellow at the Policy Center for the New South. Jérôme Melon, Head of Policy and Operational Support and Coordinator for West and Central Africa at the United Nations. And Norman Stampidja, Associate Professor at FGSOS at l'UM6P. Before giving the floor to our chair, allow us to introduce the session. As Africa confronts increasingly complex security challenges, the African peace and security architecture finds itself at a critical juncture. The effectiveness of APSA in managing crises and advancing collective security across the continent is being tested, not only by persistent instability, but also by the emergence of new threats, such as transnational terrorism, hybrid conflicts, and climate-induced risks. In this evolving landscape, there is a growing recognition that reactive approaches are no longer sufficient. Rethinking the continent's collective security framework has become imperative. Structural and institutional reforms are needed to enhance APSA's ability to operate effectively and deliver timely coordinated responses. The demand for more proactive mechanisms raises pressing questions about the strategic and advisory tools required to strengthen the African Union Commission's capacity for anticipation and action. So how effective has the African peace and security architecture been in managing crises and promoting collective security across Africa? And what structural, institutional, and strategic reforms are necessary to enhance APSA's operational effectiveness, including improving coordination, early warning systems, and crisis response? Abslam Jaldi, the floor is yours.
And, gentlemen, good afternoon. Welcome you all in this latest panel of the 9th edition of the African Peace and Security Annual Conference. So the subject of this panel concerns essentially the new treat shaping the APSA, the African Peace and Security Architecture. The African peace and security architecture, which constitute a classical subject of African security studies, as well as a subject in move, because I think on the one hand, this mechanism constitutes the main African Union framework established in order to manage and to resolve the ongoing security dynamics across Africa. I think today we are together totally agree that the African and the Peace Security Council, the main African Union body responsible for maintaining peace and security would suffer a major blow if this mechanism, the APSA were cease operating. But on the other hand, this mechanism, the APSA, is today facing a new and in particular complex form of threat from terrorism, from cyber criminality embodied by the artificial intelligence technologies, maybe more than any other emerging technologies today, to the growing complexity surrounding the climate migration or the transnational crimes. Moreover, I think this challenge are often unpredictable and cross border, requesting a faster and more effectiveness measure. So, consequently, the APSA has made significant progress in terms of peace building, in terms of peace keeping, in terms of early warning. It still faces issues like limited funding, like political interference, like the weak regional cooperation. Reason why I think it will be more appropriate to discuss on all the following things with our distinguished speaker, Professor Zakaria Abu Dahab, professor at University Mohammed V Rabat, our Reda Yamouri, senior fellow at the Policy Center for New South, from United Nations, Mr. Jérôme Melon, Mr. Melon, you are head of policy, operational support, and coordinator for West Central Africa, and finally, Professor Norman, associate professor professor at University Mohammed VI. However, before giving the floor to our speaker, I would like to invite to audience to answer the following question, of course, related to the panel. So, according to your opinion, of course, in one word, what is the greatest challenge currently facing peace and security in Africa? Okay. Not yet. So now I will give the floor to Professor Zakaria Abu Dahab. Alors, Professeur Abu Dahab.
Professor Abu Dahab.
Yes. Si vous pouvez plus ou moins nous clarifier.
If you could provide us an insight about the concept framework of the African security. What do you mean by African security, and what is the relationship that the African security has with different dynamics here in Africa? Dear colleagues, thank you very much for this question, for inviting me over. I do not believe that I can answer this question in all its with all its complex dimensions, but after the coffee break, I think we can give a good impression and an approach which is somehow... Does the microphone work? Yes, it does. Sometimes this concept can, in fact, lead to further reflections, especially when we talk about security and safety in Africa, especially when we talk about it from a diplomacy standpoint. It's constituted of several elements. First of all, the Council of Security and Safety with a special representation, a special rotation as well, with an agenda that was declined according to, an agenda that was actually deployed according to the peace-building mechanisms, with also a mechanism of early warnings, which means that this mechanism is able to detect any types of crisis before it arises, in particular when it comes to peace building, and also comparing different situations with, of course, the Committee of Desage, which we can see here in the protocol. And in this protocol, we should not forget about the Commission of the African Union, which is also part of this architecture. So we have a certain diversity of mechanisms that we can call for. First of all, and to prevent also other ones. And this reminds me about an important notion, which has a value with a General Assembly that was adopted in 2005, which is about the responsibility to protect. We can see clearly that when it comes to the reality, we have we have a difference between, in terms of ambitions. We had a very good ambience in 2002, but before that, in 2004, and with this architecture, and when we look into the different documents, rarely we have seen this to be done operationally, and I'm talking about different forces that exist at the ECOWAS or CDAO, wherein we have to push the different protagonists to respect commitments of international law as well as human rights regarding the CDAO. I think you're aware of it. We had an election that was contested, and the different forces were called to help, because the different regional committees are, in fact, the ones respecting such commitments of safety and security. So from a continental standpoint, or the regional and national levels, this means that we need to have further collaboration. So from this doctrine of peace and security, as it was thought of by different founders, whether we are talking about IOA and the ones who have been able to write down the different acts in the international law, we notice today that there is what we call legislative inflation and institutional inflation. We are calling different for the use of different mechanisms because of their efficacy, but between what happened in Rwanda and RDC and how many attempts did the Nairobi, Rwanda, and Angola. And the lady some time back spoke about Malawi and the SADC region, which in fact is very prevalent in the region, and wherein there is no stabilization mechanisms and where there is no intergovernmental collaboration, which was created in 2007, and wherein we try to transform it into a regional economy. I wouldn't forget also to mention an organization that sometimes is not mentioned, which is the SANSAD. It's the community of Sahel states, and after the disappearance of the Muammar al-Gaddafi from Libya, they had to work again on a new consensus and readapt and also readjust operational missions, because the Sahel, and we spoke about different threats, including climate change, the load on the water resources, as well as the different organized crimes. So we have structures in place, and there's always a deficit when it comes to efficacy and implementation. Thank you, Professor Abu Dahab, for being clear on your contribution.
To Professor Reda Al-Yamouri, Reda, if you can explain us the concept of African security and what does the concept of neutrality mean exactly?
Thank you, and thanks for having me. And I think before we talk about that and before we talk about architecture, I am personally going to talk about the threats, because we need to understand the threats that we are facing in Africa. We know that's one of them, and the elephant in the room. And we talk about governance, and the majority of people also will talk about terrorism. It's important to also continue to remind ourselves that terrorism did not create the problems in the Sahel or Lake Chad Basin or the Great Lakes. They exploited the environment. That's how they existed, and that's how they continue to exist and evolve and continue to expand. So I think it's a major threat. And now that we know that they do exist, and we know what the threats, what threats they pose on different states in the region and in the whole continent of Africa. But I'm going to focus on the major recent trends that I think, if we are looking into a new frameworks, new concepts, I think we need to understand how these groups also are evolving. So for someone that does daily monitoring on how these groups operate, I think I want to talk about two key points that I have seen happening in recent months. The first one is how these groups previously they operate mainly in the rural areas. More recently, if you look at the heat maps of the conflicts and violence and where they operate, you see they are continuing to circle urban centers. This is happening mainly in Mali and Burkina Faso and Niger, as well as in the Lake Chad Basin in northeast Nigeria and northern Cameroon, as well as in Difa region of Niger. So they used to operate in rural areas, but now they are posing a serious threat on urban centers. How they are doing that? So if you look at the data also, like in recent months, they start using drones. Since March, GNM alone in Mali and in Niger, Burkina Faso conducted 10 drone attacks. So this is alarming because we can see how they are evolving, but simultaneously we talk about these actors, but we need to talk about what the states are doing, what the militaries on the other side are doing. I think there is that lack of coordination, lack of evolving with how the groups are operating. So I think it's good to remind ourselves how they are operating, to do that mirror analysis and mirror of like how they are thinking. They are no longer these guys in the desert with flip-flops or boo-boos. So they are actually a real threat to the states. All beyond the Sahel and the Lake Chad Basin, other groups in Africa also conducted attacks using drones, including the Islamic State in Central Africa, as well as Al-Shabaab. So this is a threat not just in the Sahel and Lake Chad Basin, but also throughout the continent. And they alarm me because they also learned how to use AI, offline AI. So it's very difficult to know how they use AI and how they learn to operate drones. So this is also very, to see how these groups are evolving and moved beyond the traditional jihadist groups in these regions. So I'll pass to like just a couple of recommendations. I think for militaries in Africa, and I think they need to rethink, they need to conduct red team, what we call it, red team exercises with not just unilaterally, but with other partners in the region, especially when we talk about Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, but also with the threat of the expansion of GNM and the Islamic State into northern coastal states in Benin, Togo, Ghana, Cote d'Ivoire, and Guinea. They need to coordinate and collaborate and conduct exercises to see how these groups are operating and using this. In addition to that, establish a database of these attacks. To understand those trends, because if you don't understand them, you're not going to have an adequate response to it. So you need to do that, in addition to acquiring technology, etc. The last point, and I will stop, as a researcher and as I am not an AI expert, I think also experts working on conflicts also need to partner with AI experts to see how these groups are using AI, how they're using technology to continue to pose that threat, to reduce that gap between us as researchers and technology experts, so we can make actionable recommendations to policymakers in the language that they can understand. And I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Derrida. Now about you, Jerome, as Onesian, of course. So, as you know, the United Nations is like the African Union. It's not a single organization. It's archipelago of organization. And among this ecosystem, some bodies work relatively very well, like the Peace Building Department. So, my two questions. On one hand, how do you perceive or how do you foresee the current relation between the United Nations and APSA, the African Peace and Security Architecture? And as a second question in particular, what do you think on this dichotomy between justice and security with the focus, of course, on Africa?
Shukran, merci. Thank you for this invitation, but also a very thought-provoking conference so far, very impressive. I'll be speaking in my personal capacity, not on behalf of the United Nations and in English, but please feel free to ask questions in French. My UN experience, you alluded to that, is a lot about justice and security sector reform in sub-Saharan Africa, so this is the particular angle I would have when regarding the APSA. So as was mentioned already, I think APSA is not only a cornerstone of continental peace efforts, but also a critical interface for delivering people-centered security grounded in the rule of law. Since its inception, we discussed that APSA has made notable contributions to manage crises and promote collective security. And very interestingly, I think the UN has worked in support of or alongside APSA mechanisms in many ways and in many places. So in 2017, the UN and the AU signed the joint framework for enhanced partnership in peace and security that formalized our cooperation on conflict prevention, peace operations, which led to joint assessments, coordinated action in places like Sudan, Somalia, Central African Republic. The UN also supported, for example, the African Standby Force through logistics planning, but also training. The training exercise I'm thinking about, like Amani Africa 2. The UN contributed to the continental early warning system that we mentioned already through technical support and data sharing initiatives. We had joint missions for mediation in places like Libya, Sudan, and we already mentioned the Gambia. And again, in those places, the UN working closely with the African Union, but also regional economic communities like ECOWAS. So those efforts, I think, to answer your first point, reflect the UN commitment to enhancing APSA's operational and institutional capabilities through joint action and mutual reinforcement. However, despite those, the investments by the African Union, of course, but the AU and the UN, and other partners, APSA's effectiveness has been, let's say, uneven, often constrained by political will, resource limitations, and coordination challenges with those very regional economic communities. Actually, one of those challenges that I experienced firsthand was illustrated by the G5 Sahel Joint Force, established in 2017, but outside of APSA, and seen by many as competing unnecessarily with the Nouakchott process, which was established, I think, 4 years earlier, or with the ECOWAS standby force, which are both APSA mechanisms. Also, in too many cases, perhaps responses by APSA structures have been reactive or delayed or hampered by limited operational capability, especially in addressing, to get to your second point, justice and rule of law deficits, which I believe lie at the root of many crises. As Rida eloquently explained, the nature of the threats confronting Africa is evolving. We have transnational terrorism, hybrid conflicts, climate-induced displacement, violent extremism, but also cyber threats. Those evolving threats require more agile, anticipatory, and inclusive security strategies. So this is particularly true when it comes to institutions of justice and security, which often represent the front lines of state legitimacy in the eyes of the affected communities. So just like the UN, APSA needs to adapt. But adaptation must begin with the recognition that traditional peacekeeping and mediation efforts are insufficient in isolation. Many of emerging threats I mentioned thrive in environments where institutions of justice and security are weak, politicized, or absent altogether. So without strong national systems that ensure justice, that uphold human rights, that deliver public security fairly, I believe APSA's capacity will remain very constrained in terms of managing conflict. So adaptation therefore requires a deep integration of rule of law and institutional resilience into APSA's strategic posture. As part of my United Nations work, I constantly emphasize that strengthening justice and security institutions must not only be done after a conflict or a crisis, it must be part of the prevention toolbox. So with that in mind, I thought maybe of 5 very, very quick recommendations based on my experience and my area of expertise. Firstly, about improving coherence, it was mentioned, between regional and continental bodies. APSA's strength lies in this continental reach, but it's only effective if the AU, the RECs, and the national institutions coordinate effectively. Second, and also that was alluded to, making better use of early warning. The continental early warning system seems currently quite underutilized. It needs stronger analytical capability, maybe greater integration, I believe, with justice and security indicators, and a more effective political mechanism that can translate warnings into preventive deployments or diplomatic action. Thirdly, I think that deploying rule of law missions should be done earlier. In many cases, we wait too long to engage justice and security or policing institutions. APSA should allow for mobile teams of legal, judicial, and security sector experts that can deploy pre- or, let's say, early crisis to prevent institutional collapse and protect civic space. Fourth, and kind of related to my third point, I believe that rule of law and governance, which is the largest word in this word cloud. So rule of law and governance should be mainstreamed into all the peace and security engagements, from early warning all the way to peace support operation. This could actually include embedding that expertise within APSA structures, and for that purpose, APSA could benefit from more formalized and sustained collaboration with partners such as my UN Office of Rule of Law and Security Institutions. And lastly, APSA should really champion localized solutions. We've been discussing this. Many of Africa's most enduring conflicts are rooted in local grievances, so those mechanisms and those responses should be localized. So APSA, a little bit like the UN, stands currently at a crossroads. The next phase must be one defined by agility, institutional depth, and preventive capacity. But without a sufficient focus, I believe, on strengthening justice and security delivery, APSA will always be fighting symptoms and not the causes. Thank you.
Thank you so much, dear Jérôme. Now, to conclude, I will give the floor to Professor Norman. You have the floor, Norman.
Thank you very much. Also, thanks very much to the Policy Center for the New South for the invitation. This is really a good time for me. I think it has been for the last 3 years to reflect on peace and security in Africa. So I'm really thankful, and I'm really honored to be here. The beauty of speaking last is that most of the issues have been dealt with. So what I'm going to do is really to expound on most of these issues, hopefully in 8 minutes. So, yeah, right. Okay, so I'll begin with the issue of collective security. I was asking myself, what's the prerequisite to have a successful collective security arrangement? And some few points came out. Impartiality in applying the system's rules. So states agree in the collective security that if somebody breaks the rules, we deal with him or her. Sorry, I mean, I'm using him. But basically, if a state basically doesn't do what is required of it, then others come in. We've seen this in Iraq after invaded Kuwait. The other issue is sufficient military strength to deter aggression. I think we again saw this in Iraq, Kuwait. Thirdly, willingness of member states to subordinate themselves to the interests of the collective good. Now, this is very, very important, especially if you look at sub-regional bodies today, and I'll come back to it. But it's something that we need to focus on. The last point is membership of key powers, for example, in the region, to make sure that there's a bit of a military arm, or kind of like strength, to force other non-compliant states to comply. Some of the points I picked out, I mean, some of them are contestable, but I think what is of interest for me today, especially the willingness among member states to subordinate themselves to the collective good. Now, there have been some few good things that have emerged in terms of collective security in Africa. For example, we've seen the rising agency among African Union, especially sub-regional bodies, in intervening in situations that concern them. I think we've seen this in East Africa, in the DRC, we've seen this in SADC, intervening in Mozambique, and also ECOWAS, previous in the 90s, but also continuously. We've seen also Africa playing a leading role in mediation. I think we saw this in South Sudan. And so we can see that there's a bit of agency. So this is kind of like the good news that is coming out of collective security arrangements in Africa. The challenges, obviously there's changing conflict dynamics. I'm not going to labor on that. I think the panel touched on them, so I'm going to skip that because I'll be repeating what they've said already. I want to talk about actors and also global dynamics. So I'm going to feed into the previous session, but kind of like bring out some of the key points. Now, when you go back to the willingness of African states to subordinate themselves to arrangements, we've seen this with the African Union, with ECOWAS, East African Community, SADC. Now, what has happened today, for example, with Sahelian states, is that they've rejected the consensus that they had signed up to with ECOWAS. And so when ECOWAS tried to enforce the rules, they pulled out. And so what we are seeing, for example, in West Africa, is the fragmentation that is beginning to emerge. And so the collective security arrangement is breaking down. Now, the dangers that emerge from that is that, yes, the certain states have broken off, and that is going to cause a breakdown of communication in terms of collaboration, in terms of dealing with the challenges that are emerging in the region. Now, if you move on to the other issue that is emerging with a breakdown of consensus is that it's a trickle-down effect that has emerged from the global perspective. Because globally, we are also seeing a reversal of the norm-based, rule-based system. And so this has had a trickle-down effect. And so we are seeing the reemergence of a hard state, or the recentering of the state in international politics. And this obviously creates challenges for international organizations, even sub-regional bodies, in trying to come up with collective security arrangements. Now, also, we've seen middle powers emerging in mediation, and I'm going to, dovetail into what I wrote down her name, Geta Cho talked about earlier. So as she was speaking, I was also like she was reading my mind. Yeah, but anyway, what we're seeing here is that middle powers are emerging and they're playing a massive role, and that is pushing the AU on the periphery. Previously, we saw IGAD, for example, working with the UN in the South Sudan, but also what we are seeing today is the emergence of middle-ranking powers, especially in the Gulf, but also, they talked about Turkey, engaging in mediation, and so that brings questions around the AU. What role is it going to play? And the other issue is the military intervention by global powers, and that has pushed up conflicts on the escalation ladder, because most of them are interested in getting the state on side. In the Cold War, we had a kind of like a play whereby maybe the USSR supported the rebels, the USA supported the state. What we are seeing today is that all the great powers are moving in on the state. And this gives the state a lot of primacy, and it moves up the conflict on the escalation ladder. And I think Geta Chow talked about this when you look at conflict events that are emerging, especially when the big powers intervene. They go up, and so there's less room to negotiate. I'll go quickly. Solutions, because I know the time you spent. One last point, again, it was talked about in the previous section, the competition between sub-regional bodies. And I think we've seen this between SADC and East African Community in the DRC. Both are pursuing different aims. East African Community is interested in maybe having a peace to keep. And so they went in there to encourage peacekeeping, while SADC was coming in, try to enforce the peace. But also here, we forget the role of the state, that is the DRC, which was leveraging its kind of like membership to both organizations to make sure that it gets the best out for itself. And so that creates the dynamic that is of competition and conflict between sub-regional bodies. But the challenge also here is that these sub-regional bodies have overlapping memberships. And so the competition is happening in a constricted space. And if you throw in natural resources and strategic placement of a country, then you have a cocktail of competition between sub-regional bodies, creating a dilemma for the African Union, for that matter. So 2 solutions that I came up with. I think you also help us here in terms of unpacking this. Improving coordination between sub-regional bodies, especially in overlapping areas of influence. And so the AU needs to come up with ground rules. Yes, sub-regional bodies are very strong, especially in pursuing their interests, but also it's important for the AU as the overarching body to come up with rules and regulations around any competition that may arise. So it's very important in this regard, because I don't think the AU oversaw this coming up. But also the danger is that these overlapping memberships are creating this dichotomy. The last point I want to talk about, again, it has been talked about here already, strengthening preventive mechanisms, like early warning systems, but also the greater role for the panel of the wise. And so here you make sure that you keep the genie in the bottle, because once the conflict breaks out, it's free for all. States are going to get involved, big powers are getting involved, and becomes very difficult for the AU to assert itself on these basically conflicts, or even sub-regional bodies. And so I think I'll end there for now. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, dear Norman. So now we'll give the floor to the participants. If you have, of course, a question or if you would like to express an observation or remarks. Unfortunately, we'll have only 15 minutes for the QR, so please try to be brief and concise. You can, of course, express your question in English or in French. So, please, yes. Yes. Okay.
I'll be very brief. My question is for Rida. If you could expand more on the idea of offline AI. I kind of liked that one. And then for Monsieur Melon.
And I have a question
About global peace from the UN perspective, but you said today that you wouldn't be speaking in the name of the UN. Right, but even in your personal name, what does peace and security mean for the globe, and who do we give it to in the first place? Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was quite insightful. My question will be more like general, so it can go to each of the panelists actually. So when we think about the APSA settings, I wonder if this is really well equipped to face the current threats that peace and security is going through on the continent. First, when you the design of the APSA setting was probably not thought, in my view, for threats such as terrorism. So we have seen an increasing amount of groups on the continent creating havoc and chaos in regions such as the Sahel. I believe that the APSA system probably was not well equipped for that. I would like to hear your views on that. Another thing that was also mentioned this morning is the return of interstate conflicts on the continent. So around the 2000s, with the adoption of the Constitutive Act of the African Union, I don't think we were in that setting, mindset at least, thinking that we are going to deal with interstate conflicts. It was more focused, on dealing with internal threats. So these two aspects make me really think about the pertinence of the setting right now. But that also brings me, and I will stop here, to even deeper dimension or criticism. So what does collective security mean in the context where there is no feeling of collectiveness? So to be quite honest, today, even on the African continent, how many countries think in terms of collective? I don't see much, and I would like to hear from you on this. Thank you.
Merci, Monsieur le Modérateur. Merci.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you to the panelists. The question I would like to ask is, everyone is noticing that the African Union is obsolete today. The Security Council is also obsolete. And let me remind you that Morocco formulated some reforms. One of them was the issue of reforming African Union systems today. And the Foreign Affairs, Peace and Security Council, there's the problem of the votes in case of conflict. Second, the limits of mandates. 16 years, the one country was head of this this council, and this caused many problems. Don't you think that we need now to tackle this issue, the limitation of mandates? Because this institution is the engine of the African Union, and thank you. Thank you, Chair. I think that in a conflict, in a war, it's better to be a woman at the front and not to be a woman, because my question is addressed to Mr. Melon. The 1325 resolution and the Women, Peace and Security agenda is taken into consideration, and does the UN prioritize this connection, and does it take into consideration this agenda? Thank you.
The first one would be on, you said that terrorism, well, it's not really a new threat, but they find like the context and the environment that was suitable for them to thrive. And then you said we need to really tackle this threat. Don't you think that we should like more think about what were the root causes, what lead to that context for terrorism to thrive, and then we try to address that. And then here, one of the root causes that was presented was maybe like the lack of like a strong state. And then here, maybe one of the solutions would be to reinforce the state. But what we can see is that many missions, either of the African Union or the United Nations, they focus on security more than development and governance. And here I have a question regarding the United Nations. For instance, like in Mali with MINUSMA, normally the mandate was more political and military, but like on the ground, it was like the focus was more on short security gains, but it never led to sustained peace. And also when it comes to the coordination with the African Union, normally there was a FISMA, and then after the end of a FISMA, normally the African Union was supposed to be involved and coordinate with the UN, but that didn't really happen. So I would really love to know like more why there's this lack of coordination between the two. There have been some initiatives like Resolution 2719 and the tripartite agreements between the UN, the African Union, and also the European Union to fund the missions, for instance, of the African Union up to 75%. But there are like too many regulations that leads the African Union that they need to respect like many, I wouldn't say like an agenda, but like many objectives, like in many regulation of the UN that sometimes affect the work on the continent. Last thing is regarding the queues, because like many of the, you said that queues, they're not really advanced, but the thing is that the continental early warning system in the African Union is really advanced, and they did pretty much a lot of prediction of conflicts before they happen, but what's really happened is that we don't act on this early warning. First, there is like a political will because the states, they don't want to act on those, not to set a precedent. And two, they were also opposing the queues, and they said, once you have early warning on our states, you are affecting our reputations. And now what's happening now, following the 2021 reform at the African Union, there is no more queues. So, I mean, how can we solve this? How can we have like more political will from the member states? Because for me, that's one of the main reasons that the APSA is not really working. Thank you.
Je vous remercie pour la parole.
Thank you. We're talking about peace in Africa. My question is, don't you think that peace doctors are useful? Because the African continent has always welcomed these operations of peace doctors, but they never achieved their objectives. So do you think they are still useful, and what impact do they have? My second question is, don't you think that peace doctors in Africa and their operations aren't a way to control Africans? The mechanism of peace doctors is a mechanism that is not really legal. It is a mechanism implemented, in my opinion, to meet the United Nations objectives. But in the African context, these operations don't really resolve problems. I think they create problems. These operations of peace doctors are creating more and more conflicts and problems, and don't they control Africa by these operations? Now, for collective security or the regional forces, the RDC, the Democratic Republic of Congo, it hosted the force of East Africa Economic Forces, but also SADC troops. But unfortunately, they weren't able to work or do the work. So when we see what is done, I think we can only say that there is a problem. Is there any collective security? Because the forces that are supposed to stabilize a country are destabilizing the same country they are working to stabilize and to secure. Thank you. Thank you. We understood your question. Thank you. I hope you understood my question. Thank you. Thank you. Three key elements. Thomas Q in the 60s talked about scientific revolution structures. When something is obsolete, we need to reform it in depth. And today, we need to think about a new paradigm, security paradigm, that can integrate human security, food security, and so on and so forth. Of course, it requires African mobility involving all the actors, all the stakeholders, all economical operators, universities, think tanks, governments, etc. Second point, I think that Africa was a little left behind because the revolution or the evolution started years and years before, but Africa just some years ago started this chose to be part of this evolution. So are the institutional structures obsolete? Of course, unfortunately, yes. But we do have counter examples like the N23, complicities, etc. But my question is, imagine if there was no union, African Union. Where will be the African continent? So maybe just in terms of deterrence, the existence of this body is enabling us to, maintain some degrees of conflict. I know that it's not enough, but yes, Mr. Hassan talked about it. Unfortunately, some institutions are being hostages to some countries. But let's be honest, we have a conflict to resolve. The territorial integrity, Moroccan territorial integrity, for example. But it's not about this only, but also to take into consideration some states that want to use the African Union against territorial integrity of some countries. So yes, let's, for example, give an importance also to the UN Security Council, because otherwise we will misuse the Union, the African Union. Even in the European Union, the question of unanimity in terms of defense blocks sometimes some initiatives. And the European Union, like for example for the Balkans in the 90s. So these security questions, political questions pertaining to sovereignty are important. But today we have some kind of momentum and we need to seize it. The African Union is not what it was in 2002. You've mentioned AI, you've mentioned new technologies, new threats, etc. And I think that in terms of institutional design, African Union needs to be more efficient, optimized. Unfortunately, in Morocco, we are in a regional part of Africa where there is no economical cooperation. So yes, we need to enhance all these aspects and better manage our problems.
Some of the questions that I can answer to. So your question about offline AI, I'm not an AI person, but I can tell you two that I know that are offline that they have been using, which is Mistral and LLA MA2. So those are two offline AI software servers that they have been using. So, and the problem with that is because you cannot track them. You cannot track where they have used them and how they use them, so you can counter that. And that's why I said, like, to establish a database, not just about the incidents, but also in terms of collecting data. When you collecting those drones and those pieces of like of the drones, you know where they acquired them. Did they acquire them at the local markets, smuggled, etc.? So you can respond to that effectively. So another question I want to ask, we talk about the grassroots of the problems of like what environment was there for jihadist groups to exploit. When you look at the history of the conflicts in Mali, for example, because the conflict started in northern Mali in 2011, etc., but didn't start in 2011. We know the history of the 90s, the 60s. What the state have done in the past, instead of unifying communities that they had grievances against the state, they played one community against another. So they created division rather than unity. And they continued to do that even in 2013 when the jihadist groups pushed into central Mali. What happened, there were militias that were created, ethnic-based militias. So like, you have the Dogon militias were created that they were fighting the Fulanis who were perceived to be supporting jihadists. So you can see this vicious cycle. So they continue to create problems rather than resolving them and creating that unity. The question about the peacekeeping, I share your frustration about the peacekeeping based on my experience with MINUSMA. It's good to know that in MINUSMA, most of peacekeepers killed in MINUSMA were Africans. Why? Because there is a huge significant gap because of the equipment and the resources between the peacekeepers from Africa and other countries. When I was there, you can see in Gao, like you can see how the German peacekeepers were equipped and how the Dutch have helicopters, drones. So before they go in patrols, they have all the information so to prevent any attacks. But the African peacekeepers did not have those capabilities, and that's one of the frustrations I share with you as well. For the peacekeepers as well, it's important to know it's also one of the main threats. It's the context, it's the geography. When I spoke to MINUSMA when they first were being established in 2013, 2014, I heard from key official of MINUSMA, was like, we had no idea where we are walking into. So you walk in, like you said, it's a political, but then you find in yourself, you have to protect yourselves against terrorist organizations. So you have to protect civilians, but at the same time, you have to protect yourselves. I disagree that it's not useful, because I saw what impact they had also in some communities in northern Mali and also in central Mali. So it's not perfect, but also you have to understand the environment as well as what they have also accomplished, because they accomplished some results, but it just, unfortunately, you saw eventually that the politics, local politics where they were operating is very complex, and eventually they were asked to leave.
Oui, merci. Je vais essayer de faire rapidement. So about global peace that George mentioned yesterday, obviously what we try to aim at is peace for people. The United Nations is very much a member state or a country-based organization, so it's always sometimes a bit difficult to bring it down to communities and the population. But I have to say, the UN Peace-Building Commission is a fantastic tool, and I think that we should not only learn from it, but also try to expand its reach. It has tremendous influence on peace at the local level, and tremendous examples that we could unpack if we had more time. On women, peace and security, the United Nations specifically, les Nations Unies spécifiquement font...
The United Nations are implementing the women, peace and security agenda in all their interactions with the African Union and its members. So it's part of our efforts. It's not a subject that is apart, it's a part of our daily work. Is it efficient, 100% efficient? Of course not. We are still learning, but we recognize the impact of conflicts on women.
I established it, and I spent 5 years building up MINUSMA from the ground up. Just as a background to say that, of course, the African Union involvement was critical. Whether it was well coordinated is another story, but the MISAHEL was very present. The African Union was part of the international mediation for the peace process in Mali. I would say that perhaps the capacity of the African Union in Mali was relatively modest, and therefore there was perhaps not a forward-leaning presence as much as we would have liked, but it was not absent, and I believe the coordination with the modest presence was relatively good. Alors, est-ce que les opérations de maintien de la paix sont toujours utiles?
Are peacekeeping operations still useful? I'm not going to answer this myself, but I'm going to use peer-reviewed studies saying the UN peacekeeping
prevents the spread of violence. UN peacekeeping helps belligerents achieve peace. UN peacekeeping contributes to post-conflict peace. UN peacekeeping helps countries rebuild. And UN peacekeeping helps and contributes to the sustainable development goals. Alors, on n'a pas créé l'ONU pour amener les pays...
So we didn't create the UN to make the world some kind of paradise, but it was to save them from hell. So peacekeeping, UN peacekeeping is like any other political project. Of course, it's not perfect. It's not a complete failure, but it's not a complete success either. So let's be honest. Côte d'Ivoire, for example, Liberia, many things didn't really work, but today these countries thank peacekeeping. And to conclude, yes, the UN is present in some countries, but mainly with the consent of the host country. We tend to forget this element. When Mali asked the UN to leave, 6 months later, they weren't there anymore. So I think it's a wrong idea to think that it is imposed. There's a collaboration work that is implemented, and we work with the authorities of the country of Mali. Of course, it wasn't always easy, and when they asked us to leave, we left. Same thing for Iraq, Somalia asked us to transform, and we did. So all these examples where we were asked to leave, and we did. So this is part of our principles. Thank you.
Thanks very much. So I'll maybe respond to two questions. The one on collective security by Professor Traore. Then I'll also respond to the lady who talked about the DRC. And now with collective security, obviously, everything trickles down from the UN and then to the regional bodies and then sub-regional bodies. And so we are all basically subservient to the UN Charter. And so the idea of collective security then comes from there. I think with the African Union, or if you go back to the OAU, the rationale for existence, for example, from 1963, was about independence, decolonization, but then we got caught up in the Cold War dynamics, and so the organization didn't really develop. Post-Cold War era, we again dovetailed into the neoliberal setup, and so you have the AU coming up, talking about, obviously, issues on humanitarianism, but also other bodies began to emerge, especially under the President Mbeki era. Yeah, we have NEPAD, we have APRM emerging, and so you can see there was kind of like a shift towards connecting to the global order at the time. Now the challenge we have is that that global order is under threat, is fragmenting, and so how are we going to redefine our role, or how are we going to solve our problems? Especially, as I mentioned earlier, we are seeing a reassertion of a strong state. The states are beginning to show their dissatisfaction with the arrangements they signed up in the first place. And so I think this is not only happening actually in ECOWAS, but also I think Rwanda was refused from taking up the leadership of the Central African Economic Organization because of the conflict in the DRC. And so these are the issues that are emerging. That states are beginning to take center stage, and the neoliberal order is getting fragmented. How do we begin now to reconfigure our security or our collective security dynamics in light of the current security threats that we face? For example, right now, crime and conflict are connected. That's why we're talking about the crime-conflict nexus. We're talking about crime-terror nexus. Terrorist groups are also becoming organized criminal gangs. And so is the AU ready to deal with that, or does it have the mandate and also the expertise to deal with such issues? Obviously, this has been relegated to the issue, to the sub-regional bodies, especially with the principle of subsidiarity, but at the same time, we need the AU on top to provide guidance for the sub-regional bodies. Sorry, the time is really fast spent, so I'm going to rush through. On the issue of the DRC, that I'll get you on that. But I think there was a confusion about what role the East African community was going to play, because I think the East African community was talking about peacekeeping. So they thought they were going to keep the peace, keep the combatants apart, and then ensure that there's dialogue. But I think President Tshisekedi wanted a more robust intervention. And so that's why he got dissatisfied with the East African community and called in SADC. And then obviously SADC has also faced challenges due to the lack of preparedness, probably, to deal with the robust nature of the conflict that has elapsed. And so these are the issues that are emerging. But in a way, I think Tshisekedi maybe tried to leverage his membership in both organizations, and that created problems. Yeah, I think I'll end there. Thanks.
Amazing. So, we'll stop here. Professor Abu Dahab, Derrida, Der Jerome, Der Norman. It was a huge pleasure to be here with you, to discuss with you today on the ongoing dynamic security shape in Africa within the framework of the APSA. Thank you so much for your time, and hope to see you again with us as soon as possible.
Madame la Ministre, Mesdames et Messieurs, chers collègues.
Mrs. the Minister, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, and now it's the time for us to close this session. And for the closing remarks, for us these last 2 days conference has been highly fruitful. We have been able to hear many panelists. We've had many panels throughout yesterday. And today, I would like, in the name of Mr. Inawi, who's the chairman of the Policy Center of the New South, to thank you first and foremost for your participation and to express how much the Policy Center is proud to bring together and congregate as many experts as possible who want Africa to become a better continent and who want Africa to develop, and the ones who are in fact working hard to do what they can to develop Africa as a continent. This moment of reflection has allowed us to underline the different challenges faced by our continent, and especially during uncertainty. During these moments and times of uncertainty, we reflected upon how we can help our African Union be in the order and see what could be done and what is feasible to put in the front line while facing uncertainty. We tackled many subjects and themes to counteract uncertainties, including conflicts and violences. We spoke about the emerging threats, including cyber attacks. We also spoke about the challenges of climate change and the pressure it has on the demographical changes. Our panelists have highlighted the potential of African countries and African collectivism that can definitely help us limit the effects of the challenges that we are facing today. They have also enlightened us about the need to reflect upon major themes. They also underlined the necessity to implement actions and to not be always at the stage of theory, reflection, and speech. Democracy has also its share in your discussions. And many of our panelists and experts have also underlined the importance and the necessity of abandoning the way or the reactive approach in order to achieve proactivity. Once again, thank you very much to all of you for your participation, whether as a participant or a panelist. So have a safe journey back to your countries and enjoy the rest of your day for the ones staying in Morocco. Thank you very much.